King Henry IV, Part 2 by William Shakespeare. This is another one of my scripted reviews. The idea being I go back through my archive of kind of old book reviews and book reports and try and make a YouTube video out of them. This is something I did for a course on British literature. After we had read through a number of courses together as a class, a number of novels together as a class, or readings. We had to pick one and write a report on it. In this class, we had read King Henry IV, Part 1. That was the only Shakespeare play we read for this particular class, although I did also take a Shakespeare course later in university. I really loved King Henry IV, Part 1. I had no idea before I read it that it would be interesting. I thought the name sounded boring, but I loved Prince Hale and Falstaff and kind of all that kind of stuff. So for this, when we had our choice of what to do our independent report on, I did King Henry IV, Part 2 to kind of see where these characters carried on. And then wrote the report on it. The professor gave me a decent grade on this, A-, but he did comment that I was in danger of being captured by the critics, or kind of captured by the professionals. What was his exact words? Which at the time, I thought, well, of course. I mean, I'm 20 years old. I'm not going to put my own opinions about this play here. I'm going to research what the professionals think about it. Like, who am I to critique Shakespeare? Although rereading it now, I think, yeah, wow, I did really rely very heavily on the professional critics. There's some of my own opinions here, but it very relies heavily on, other books I read or kind of other critics, professional Shakespeare critics. Nevertheless, for what it is, here it is. I'll try and indicate what I'm quoting from another critic, but right, the review. It is considered no secret to the avid film viewer that sequels usually disappoint. Whether the sequel follows too closely to the original or deviates too much from the original format, it is often hard for filmmakers to give the audience a work they feel is worthy of its predecessor. The writers of sequels have to work with characters and a format already established, and so often the restrictions take their toll on the work. All too often, a sequel will leave the viewers wishing they had found a better way to spend their time. Although I was aware of the dangers a sequel faces in the movie theaters today, I was not expecting that Shakespeare would face the sequel problem in the Renaissance theater. Surely the immortal bard would not be subject to the same problems that plague ordinary writers. However, the problem of sequels is one that even Shakespeare and his contemporaries had to deal with. The play in two parts is a fairly frequent I'm quoting now from a professional critic who says, the play in two parts is a fairly frequent phenomenon in the late 16th and 17th centuries. Sometimes a second part was added because the first was popular. Sometimes the two parts were planned together. But in either case, it often happens that the dramatist, resuming his task with the same characters, taking their story further along the time dimension, is impelled to look more detachedly at his subject than before. End quote. After reading King Henry IV, Part 2, along with some commentaries to help me understand it, I became aware that Shakespeare did indeed suffer from the sequel problem. Although King Henry IV, Part 2 contains much that is admirable, it is inferior to its predecessor because it repeats much of Part 1 and its structure is lacking. Before beginning to point out the flaws in this work, it is worth mentioning that King Henry IV, Part 2 has much about it that is enjoyable. To hold it up against King Henry IV, Part 1 is to compare it to one of Shakespeare's most popular plays. And to say it falls short of this piece is to leave plenty of room for excellence. As one critic put it, quote, "It is, however, inferior to its predecessor as a work of dramatic art, though, in my judgment, not at all so as a work of genius." End quote. As with King Henry IV, Part 1, Shakespeare's true genius shows through in the comic scenes. More specifically, the scenes centering on Falstaff. There is one scene in which Prince Hale and Poins disguise themselves as servants, called drawers in the play, at the tavern in Eastcheap to see how Falstaff will act unaware of their presence. When they discover him bad-mouthing them, and then they reveal themselves, Falstaff must quickly explain what he has said in a manner very similar to when he was caught in his own lies in King Henry IV, Part 1. Another interesting scene finds Falstaff in battle against the rebels. When he challenges one of them, John Colville, to a fight, John Colville yields to Falstaff, afraid of him, because he believed Falstaff to be behind the death of Hotspur at Shrewsbury. You remember from King Henry IV, Part 1, Prince Hale killed Hotspur, but Falstaff claimed the credit. Shakespeare also introduces several new characters who are of great interest. There is Ancient Pistol, a friend of Falstaff, about whom one of the other characters exclaims, "Hang him, swaggering rascal, let him not come hither. It is the most foul-mouthedest rogue in England." Borrowing from a critic who says, Pistol speaks in almost entirely in borrowed phrases, retorts, and shards of theatrical language. Pistol speaks so much like a character in a play that none of the play's other characters are able to communicate with him. End quote. Also fascinating are two elderly justices who are corrected and corrupted by Falstaff, quoting a critic there. Despite the genius of this play, Shakespeare falls into some of the same pitfalls many modern film sequels do. The play repeats too much of the first. The scene I just described before, with Falstaff caught bad-mouthing the prince and Poins, is hilarious, but in many respects, this is the same gag that Shakespeare used earlier in the first Henry IV play. Although it certainly succeeds in bringing laughs, it indicates a lack of creativity on Shakespeare's part. More grating is the replay of the Prince Hale and King Henry IV theme. At the end of the first play, the audience is under the impression that Prince Hale has proven himself to his father, shown his true character, and laid aside any worries about what kind of a man he will turn out to be. Quoting a critic, however unfinished the characterization of Hale may be in Part 1, all doubts about his princeliness are erased at Shrewsbury. And even before Shrewsbury, there are hints that his relation with Falstaff will not continue. End quote. In King Henry IV, Part 2, the relationship of Prince Hale and his father deteriorates to what it was at the start of the first play, and the audience is forced to watch the path to reconciliation all over again. Things begin to go wrong again between the two when the king learns that Hale, instead of hunting at Windsor as he expected, was with Poins and his other continual followers. The king is once again filled with sorrow over his son's action. Quoting a critic, the misunderstanding will soon be resolved. Quoting a critic, the audience knows that King Henry has once again thoroughly misjudged his son, and can only hope that the misunderstanding will soon be resolved. End quote. The circumstances are different this time than in the first play. King Henry IV is on his deathbed this time, at the time of reconciliation. Yet it is essentially the same stuff. Quoting a critic, Hale's conversion from wastrel to exemplary prince has been enacted once before. Now Shakespeare must try to vary action and meaning, even as he stays within the lines of the pattern. Shakespeare is ingenious and imaginative, but just as Hale's relapse is less than convincing, so his second conversion presents problems of great moral and dramatic complexity. End quote. King Henry IV Part 2 is also lacking in structure as compared to Part 1. In King Henry IV Part 1, Shakespeare carefully sets everything up to fit in a neat framework. Hotspur and Hale are perfect as foils for each other, even if Shakespeare does have to take some historical liberties to achieve this. The play ends climatically with a battle. Even though there is no sense of finality, the play closes with a climax that the plot has been building up to all along. In fact, one critic argues, quote, pleading that Part 1 is incomplete because it does not represent the whole of Hale's redemption, is rather like arguing that Richard III is incomplete because it does not document the redemption of England under Henry Tudor. End quote. In King Henry IV Part 2, the characters are neither paired up as nicely nor presented as smoothly. Granted, things are obviously not as easy for Shakespeare here, since many of his characters are held over from the previous play. Pistol is introduced rather suddenly, and there is no accounting of where he had been during Part 1. This can be taken as an example that Shakespeare was not planning to write Part 2 when he wrote the highly structured King Henry IV Part 1. Again, quoting from a critic. Shakespeare opens Part 2 with Rumour, who sets the mood for the play. Rumour claims that he will mislead the multitudes, and this can be taken as Shakespeare's claim that he will confuse his audience by filling the play with confusing falsehoods. However, once Shakespeare has set the stage like this, he seldom returns to his original purpose. Also, although in some ways Shakespeare intends for his play to take place directly after King Henry IV Part 1, for example, the play opens with Northumberland finding out about the death of his son, which happened right at the end of the previous play, Shakespeare leaves some gaps. When the work opens, we find, work meaning the play, when the play opens, we find out from a conversation between Falstaff and his page that Hale had recently been imprisoned by Lord Chief Justice for hitting him when the two got into an argument. Sir, here comes the nobleman that committed the prince for striking him about Bardolph, quote from the play. Shakespeare gives no time frame for when this might have occurred. In writing King Henry IV Part 2, Shakespeare faces the, quote, perennial problem of sequels, how to repeat without repeating, end quote. Given the difficulty of this task, it is not surprising that Shakespeare's work experiences the problem of many film sequels today. Although it is interesting to note these deficiencies, one should not allow them to take away from what otherwise is a most intriguing play. Despite the small flaws mentioned in this paper, Shakespeare still presents a work of genius and an exciting conclusion to King Henry IV Part 1.